all three of the figurative uses of firstborn in the Septuagint text, Old Testament and Apocrypha, are either contextually clearly figurative of a nation or a tribe, or they have qualifiers like tithemi, natan, that show there's a use of firstborn here that is different from the other 129. So not one of the texts in the Septuagint text that uses firstborn in a non-literal, non-temporal sense, and I would argue they're still all applied to created beings or created tribes or creative nations, right? They're not really used apart from a temporal sense completely, but they're contextually used differently. There's nothing in Colossians 1 that suggests it's being applied to a nation or a tribe. And there's not qualifying terms like in Psalm 89, 88, 27. So Trinitarians, you need to stop committing the false analogy fallacy. You pride yourselves on being so smart. You pride yourselves on being logical and not committing fallacies and all this stuff. Why do you keep doing it? Why do you keep committing the false analogy fallacy? Because you don't have anything else to do. There is no other way to get out of it. Firstborn of all creation, Trinitarians, non-figurative, non-contextually qualified. It's literal. The beginning, the arche, just like he's called in those texts that we'll get back to in just a moment. Today, he's the firstborn. He's not figuratively the firstborn, like Israel or like Ephraim or like David. He is the firstborn. Let's go to the New Testament texts. Luke 2:7. So we've already read 2 of the 8 times prototokos is used in the New Testament text. We'll go back to it in a moment in Colossians 1:15 through 20. But let's look at a couple other uses. Let's look at all the other uses in the New Testament. Luke 2:7. This one is applied to Jesus as well, when he became a human. It says, while they were there in Bethlehem, the days came to the full for her to give birth, and she gave birth to her son, the firstborn. Mary's firstborn, Trinitarians. You know who it is? I know you know who it is. It's the same one who's God's firstborn. It's Jesus. Right here called the firstborn in a temporal sense as a human, but it's still very clear, is it not, in a temporal sense? And we know from Matthew 1, like I've talked about in my Begotten or Created series of videos, the verb ganao is used over and over and over and over again for the birthing of human children, all the way up to the birth of Jesus, like it shows right here as the firstborn, with no difference in meaning at all. He became lower than the angels, lower than the gods, referred to in Psalm 8, 5, 6. It's gods in the Hebrew, angels in the Greek Septuagint, quoted in Hebrews 2, 7 and 9, showing Jesus is lower than those kind. He became lower than the angels, lower than the gods, as the last Adam. 1 Corinthians 15:45. Right here, the firstborn, literal, temporal, non-figurative text. Now let's go to Romans 8:29. The 4th instance of firstborn in the New Testament text that we've read. Romans 8:29. Because those whom he gave his first recognition, he also foreordained to be patterned after the image of his Son. Talking about God who makes all his works cooperate together for the good of those who love God. Well, what are God's works, Trinitarians? It's us and his Son. He gave first recognition to us to be patterned after the image of his Son. that he, his son, might be the firstborn among many brothers. Now, you might argue here, it's not talking about him as like the firstborn of all creation, like Colossians 1, because it's talking about him as the first one born among many brothers, those who are foreordained to be patterned after the image of his son. We're all works of God's, though. It says so right here. But it's still temporal. He's the first one, after whom we are patterned. So it doesn't make a difference. That's why we're Christ's brothers. Matthew 25. He's the firstborn among us. It's again a temporal usage in the context of those patterned after him in a spiritual sense, a spiritual physical sense in terms of our being born as Christians and being foreordained to be born in that way after his son. It's still temporal. It's still showing he's the first among others. The first among other sons of God. The beginning of his generative power. The beginning, the first of his children. Once again, consistent with the real literal usage. Let's go to Hebrews 1:6. I've done a series of videos from Hebrews 1:1 all the way into Hebrews chapter 3. You can see those videos in the playlist for this series in the description below. Here, right after it says God spoke in many ways, including by means of a son, through whom he made the system of things, just like Colossians 1, that son is the reflection of his glory, the apalgosma, the outshining of his glory, and the exact representation of his being, character, tes, hypostaseos. He's the copy. He's the imprint. He's what's made after the image of his Father, the invisible God, Colossians 1:15. You can't get more temporal than that. He's the copy of God's being. Right after that, it says that he brings his firstborn into the inhabited earth. His firstborn, the copy of his being born. And you could argue again here that it's either referring to him being brought into the earth in the firstborn of all creation sense, or in the sense in which he was, like we read in Luke 2, brought into the earth. His firstborn was brought into the earth as Mary's firstborn, right? It called him Mary's firstborn in Luke 2:7. But it's God's firstborn that was brought into the earth, made lower than the angels, and became Mary's firstborn. He's not God's firstborn on the earth. His firstborn is brought into the earth. He's the firstborn of all creation. That's why. And we can see very clearly that as the firstborn, it's not contextually qualified. It's not used figuratively. He's not placed as firstborn. The firstborn is brought into the earth. Ha protatikos is brought into the earth and becomes Mary's firstborn. The son of Joseph the carpenter's son, just like he was the carpenter's son in heaven, the one putting all things together, Proverbs 8, Hebrews 1:10. It's the same thing, heaven and then on earth. The exact copy of his being. It's all temporal in association with bringing his firstborn into the earth to become Mary's firstborn, Luke 2:7. Let's go to Hebrews 11:28. Just a few more uses of firstborn, and then we're going to talk about all other things. 11:28. By faith, talking about Moses, he had celebrated the Passover. We read parts of this earlier, or discussed it at least, in relation to the firstborn and the firstborn of Egypt versus Israel being figuratively God's firstborn and his son. By faith he had celebrated the Passover and the splashing of the blood, that the destroyer might not touch their firstborn ones. Literal, temporal, not figurative at all. Hebrews 12:23. In the general assembly, let's read 22. But you have approached a Mount Zion and a city of the living God, heavenly Jerusalem and myriads of angels, in general assembly and the congregation of the firstborn who have been enrolled in the heavens, and God the judge of all, and the spiritual lives of the righteous ones who have been made perfect. What did we read earlier in Romans 8:29? He's the firstborn of many brothers who have been patterned after his image. The congregation of the firstborn. That's who we are. We're the brothers of the Christ, the firstborn Son of God, who became the firstborn of many brothers, sons of God. Congregation of the firstborn makes the same point essentially as Romans 8:29, and so it's being used literally for that spiritual birthing as sons of God, him being the first, and us being the ones who became sons of God after him. Now let's go to our last use of firstborn in the New Testament. We'll go back to Colossians 1, talk about all things, talk about a few more things. Revelation 1:5. Excuse me. Get my reading and talking voice moist again. Here in verse 4 it says, John, to the 7 congregations that are in the district of Asia, may you have undeserved kindness and peace from the one who is and who was and who is coming, and from the 7 spirits that are before his throne, and from Jesus Christ, the faithful witness, the firstborn from the dead, and the ruler of the kings of the earth. That ties in with our governments and the world video, by the way. Who's ruling the kings of the earth? Who's really ruling, right? Who's the one ruling? Well, we talked about it. Daniel 4:5. The firstborn from the dead. This takes us back to Colossians 1, right? Because we read in verse 18, when we started the show, he's the head of the body, the congregation. He's the beginning, the firstborn from the dead. Right, so he's not the first resurrected. We know that because of Lazarus, but Lazarus died. He's the firstborn from the dead in the sense of what? Remember Hebrews 11? The congregation of the firstborn. No, it's Hebrews 12:23. Congregation of the firstborn who have been enrolled in the heavens. The firstborn from the dead means he's the first resurrected, after which many of us are patterned, enrolled in the heavens. He doesn't die again. He was raised to the hand of the Father and is in heaven. The firstborn, the congregation of the firstborn who have been enrolled in the heavens. So when he was resurrected as the firstborn from the dead, he now lives in the heavens. It's referring to him as the first, temporal priority. It's not figurative. It's just being used in a different sense than literal birthing firstborn in a physical reproductive sense. This is life again in the heavens sense. So it's still born. He still had to be raised to life, given life by the Father, Galatians 1:1. So it's the same in that sense, just not as part of the reproductive cycle like Luke 2:7. But it's still firstborn, first one born, whether it's the first one born of Mary of human children or the first one born to life in heaven, it's still firstborn. Every single use of firstborn in the New Testament, we'll set aside Colossians 1:15 for a second, means firstborn, first one born, the first one of those born, whether on earth or in heaven. And it's the same in Colossians 1. In fact, In Colossians 1:18, it qualifies it even further, right? The beginning, the arche. Just like Proverbs 8:22, wisdom is the arche. Just like Revelation 3:14, the arche of God's creation. And every single time arche is used with the genitive, as I showed in my video, Jesus is the beginning of God's creation according to Revelation 3:14. It means he's a part of the group. In the same way, when it says he's the firstborn of all creation, Trinitarians try to get away from this and say he's the firstborn over all creation. It's such a ridiculous attempt to try to get out of this text, because not only does firstborn clearly mean first one born, like it does in every single other New Testament text, and 129 times of the 132 or so times used in the Old Testament and the Apocrypha, apart from clear figurative uses, 3 of them, that's what it means. The first one born. Of what? Or over what? Creation. If he's not a part of creation, what's the point of saying he's of or over it? Why even make an association? There would be no reason to just refer to him as the one through whom God made everything. It doesn't. It associates him directly with creation as the firstborn in a literal sense. No qualifiers, no tithemi, no use of a term for a nation or a tribe, an individual of the invisible God. That's who it describes. And it calls him the firstborn in a temporal sense again several verses later, in addition to calling him the arche. And right here, it says he's the one who is first in all things. In the Greek text, it specifically states, in order that he might become in all things being the first, having the first place. So that's what you might consider more of a preeminent sense, but that's because he's the first one. That's what preeminent is, Trinitarians. Sometimes Trinitarians try to say, because of texts like Psalm 88, 89, 27, and David being placed as firstborn, right? That's a clear figurative use. A clear figurative use clearly qualified by a verb that's not used in Colossians 1:15, but it says right there in verse 18 that he might be first in all things. En pasin autos protuon. Well, if he's the first in all things, Trinitarians, right? Not all other things, according to you, well, then he would have to be the first creation, wouldn't he? Or he doesn't hold the first place in everything. He's not first in all things then, Trinitarians. You better start using other or some other qualifier to explain away the last part of verse 18. He's not only the firstborn of all creation, verse 15. He's not only the beginning, the arche, verse 18. He's the one who is first in all things. Protuon, pasin. Hina genetai en pasin autos protuon. That he might become the one who is first in all things. Well, if he's not the first creation, he's not the first in all things. And therefore you would have to agree, all things does not mean all things in every usage. And in fact, the very context that you take issue with the NWT using other to show that all things excludes the firstborn, the one who was just described as the first one born.